Well, hi folks, here we are again. Welcome to another Tuesday evening and another live stream, a property-based live stream tonight. I have Chris Bates ready to come in a moment or two. But just before I bring him in and start the show properly, we'll just let people drift in. I've got a few questions, but there's plenty of time for more questions if you want to put them into the chat as we go forward. Of course, there's always the old question of the doggy cam. And at the moment, I have a slight problem. I have the doggy bed, but no doggy cam. So I'm not sure whether they were there a moment ago. I'll try and find them in a moment or two. They've obviously taken for a bit of a walk around the place. I took them out for a long walk earlier this evening, and they came back and were absolutely pooped. But I'm not sure where they've actually decided to go to sleep. So I'll try and shake them back sometime before the end of the show. So they're around though. They are around, and good to see good names, old names, new names, a lot of names on already. So thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. All right. Well, I'm going to take the pre-show off, and we'll start the show properly and bring Chris in. So hang on. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 23rd of March 2021. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on board. Thanks very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. This week, of course, we're going to focus on property, and there is just so much to talk about. We're going to work hard to try and squeeze it in the time we've got, but a lot to cover. Just before I bring Chris in, I will just remind you as always that this isn't financial or legal advice, it's a general conversation only. Please also do play nice in the chat room. We do moderate the stream. This is as at 23rd. It's out of date by a day, sorry about that. 23rd of March 2022. Use at Walk the World to get my attention, and especially if you want to ask a question, let's make sure I see it. And also, I do encourage other conversations in the chat. Feel free to, say what you want. But if you want me to pick it up and see a question, use that Walk the World. I've also enabled Super Chat, which enables me to get your question top of the list, or indeed, if you'd like to make a contribution to what we do here to help us fund, that would be great. Thank you very much in advance for all the Super Chats. And with that, and without further ado, I'm going to push this button, and hopefully Chris Bates will appear. Hi, Chris. How are you doing?
Martin, good to see you. It's been, I think we chatted about 5 months ago, so it's probably been our longest break since we been doing these for about 3 years. So good to finally chat.
It's been a while, but you've had a mini bait.
Yeah, now second one, I've probably got a bit of a slobber on my shoulder. It was quite funny. I just picked him up then. He's only 4 months, and my daughter just turned 2 a couple of weeks ago. So it's been a pretty crazy time in the Bates household, 2 under 2, which I can't say anymore, unfortunately, because it's got a bit of a ring to it. But yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming on and spending some time with us this evening. And look, over the last 6 months, the property market has really changed dramatically, right? Almost beyond recognition. So I really want to spend as much time as I can with you in terms of getting to, what's really going on. But I guess I wanted to pose an interesting teaser on the way in here. I had a fascinating question from one of my followers who was first-time buyer, and they essentially went to the bank and said, how much can we afford to borrow? And the bank said, about 850, 900,000, and this is what your repayments would be, etc., right? And they said, well, we've done our own calculations and we think we can afford to make this amount of repayment each month, which translates it to a much lower amount, right? And it wasn't the income multiple. What it was the difference between the assumptions the bank was making on what their level of expenditure actually was using HEM and what their real life expenditure was. And I guess what I wanted to throw at you as a sort of a first pass conversation is this typical? Is this often the case? Are we getting differences between what the banks think people can borrow and what people themselves think they can borrow? And which side of the fence do people tend to sort of land on?
Look, I think in the past you could always borrow a lot more than you wanted to borrow, right? So you'd go into a bank and they would say they'd lend you $1 million. And you're like, wow, I don't need $1 million. I only need 500. And that was fine when property prices were cheaper, right? But I think what happened is, property prices got more expensive and people now go to the bank and say, actually, I need more because the price of properties have gone up. And it's usually not a case where they're looking to maximize their capacity. I mean, the living expenses issue is a real issue this year. I mean, when you've got rising inflation, living expenses are obviously a lot more unknown and have jumped a lot, and everything's going up. So it's a real issue, A, because people are spending a lot, but B, it's going up a lot. I mean, what banks are using for loan application, prior to the Royal Commission, there was a massive elephant in the room. Most applications were going through with customers declaring less than the minimum or around the minimum or just above the minimum. And the minimums were much lower as well, like HEM thresholds were much lower. And so, banks were still sensitizing the interest rate, and so to protect borrowers, but they were completely under recognizing real living expenses. Now, the Royal Commission highlighted that. There's a big fight between ASIC and Westpac. It was a big moment, 2018. I feel like this 2022's almost got that sort of same feel to it. Where, the banks were potentially going to get sued. A lot of people were given loans that they probably shouldn't have got given. And it was a real sort of, scary year for the banks. But the banks basically won. ASIC lost. And since sort of, 2019, the banks have been, bit by bit stepping back from looking at living expenses. And if you're not really banking with that bank, they're not really going into a lot of detail. They're not asking questions around what your day-to-day sort of spending. They're just using what you declare. And so that issue where, they've walked into a bank and they said that you can borrow X is because they're just sort of assuming that you're spending, a reasonable amount every month. They're not going and cross-referencing it. And so, that's just pretty much what's happening now. But you've got to be really careful, because if you go into a bank and think, okay, they'll lend me whatever, without doing a cross-reference and saying, actually, you know what, I'm actually spending $7,000 a month. They think I'm spending $4,000. The bank's not protecting me here. If interest rates go up, they're basing on a much lower, living expenses. So absolutely, you've got to do your own numbers and, look at what your net income is, look at what your mortgage repayments are going to be, look at what your fixed expenses are, look what your variable expenses are, what could you cut back if things got tough. If interest rates went up, you need to have these conversations prior to taking out a big loan. Unfortunately, I don't think most people do, but that's obviously what you should be doing.
Right. And the point there is, of course, that a lot of people don't do those sorts of calculations or cash flows. They basically go into the bank says you can borrow X. The bank makes certain assumptions about what a typical household would be able to spend. And of course, typical is atypical quite often for many people. And then, of course, that immediately puts them on the back foot. So one of the reasons why my mortgage stress numbers are rising quite fast is that quite often they're spending a lot more than the bank assumes, right? And interestingly, the banks often don't know that in their data set, so that they actually they don't see it. So that's one of the reasons why there's a bit of a gap between what I'm seeing from the household perspective and what the banks are doing with regard to the underwriting standards.
Yeah, I don't really ever say that, don't worry about mortgage stress because the banks are sensitizing interest rates, because, you and I both know that their living expenses are much higher than what they're declaring at the banks. And so the banks aren't really sensitizing them by 3% above the current interest rate. It's much, much tighter than that for a lot of households. And I guess most people, unfortunately, also have to borrow up to their limit for a lot of the situations, whether just because of the price of the properties they want to enter and the capital cities and unaffordability, etc. So, they haven't really even got the choice to say, oh, I'm going to spend, 3 times my salary, because properties are much more expensive than that, right? So, it doesn't surprise me all your stress data and where it is and, where it's going to hit hardest. I think it's just common sense, unfortunately, where, these risks are sort of playing out.
Yeah, interesting. And I will just put this chat up from Cross Exchange. We're a bit shocked to see similar products to my data on the web. Actually, it's my data. What they did was they took my postcode data and with my permission, they rolled it up to the LGA level. So that's why it's been published on news.com and a few other places too. But it's actually my data, because there is nobody else doing mortgage stress the way that I'm doing it, which is looking at real cash flow, right, and looking at discretionary and non-discretionary expenditure and income, and trying to figure out what people actually have. And the ABC covered it, the News Corps cover it, and a few others too. So suddenly everybody's talking about it. And Chris, it's just worth reflecting on this. I did a calculation. I took the CBA 30-year mortgage calculator at 1.99%, right? And then I put the 1.99% up to 3% and looked at what the monthly repayment changed to, right? And it went up by 15%, right? And if it went from 1.99% to 4%, that was a 30% increase in the monthly repayment, assuming that you've still got the 30-year loan there. I don't think people understand how this works when interest rates go up.
Oh, I think that, 2% interest rates, I don't think anyone in the last couple of years have thought that they're going to stay at 2%. People have been pretty confident they're going to stay lower than what they're probably going to be. I think that's the big change that, since our last conversation is APRA came in late last year and they sort of put the 5% reduction to borrowing capacities. And that was to slow the market down. At that point in time, I was like, well, you need to do something bigger than that, because that's only going to just really, it's not enough. But obviously, we've had global inflation outbreak across the world. A lot of banks across the world are having to lift interest rates, etc. So that's been the big shift, right? I don't think people really, think at their 2% interest rates, they were going to stay there forever. I think they've already started to think that, maybe they're going to be 3%. So in our 2% interest rates, they were really affordable for a lot of people. It's when they sort of go, the 5s and 6s and things like that, that's when I think, the jumps get really big, because I think they're already sort of factoring in that they're going to be 3 or 4. But if they start going higher than that, that's when I think a lot of people are going to get really caught out.
Yeah, but do you think people understand that even, from 1.99 to 3%, that's a 15% increase in the monthly repayment?
Oh, I do think that, people are expecting, that type of increase. I don't think they're thinking that they're going to stay at 2% forever. Yeah, sure, people are just, they thought that maybe that's going to be the rate for 30 years. But, when they've signed the loan docs and they've gone to a bank, et cetera, they know the interest rates are at zeros. They know they're going to go up at some point. I think going from 2 to 3, I think they're going to be able to manage that. It's more a case if it goes to 4, 5, 6, that's when I think you're going to really see borrowers go, wow, I didn't think it was going to go up by 40%. And incomes are, my expenses are much tighter now, and, fuel costs, and, I didn't get that, wage increase, or we're going to have to work part-time, or if my casual income's been dropped back. So that's when I think you'll get crunched on both sides.
Right. And so I guess the broader question then is, with higher interest rates coming, with the APRA tighter changes in terms of the buffer that came in, and the other things in terms of the borrowing parameters that lenders are currently using, what does this do then to the property market?
Look, I think we naturally sort of slowed down in credit demand late last year. I just think the amount that the Sydney market, Brisbane, not so much. Brisbane's kind of gone strong into 2022, but, in Sydney, Melbourne, just because of how much prices have risen, a lot in the regions as well, our buyers were already starting to get much pickier. They were starting to be a bit more patient. They were like, I'm not just going to enter. I feel like it's gone a bit too above itself. It felt quite frothy. And I think a lot of the results that were achieved, middle to even early 2021 weren't getting replicated again. There were some massive results. And I think that was because buyers were like, I can't justify this. And they were already starting to say, well, I'm not going to do that unless it's a quality asset. But then that's amplified much bigger this year, because people are saying, well, I'm going to be even more pickier because our interest rates are going to rise much faster, etc. So absolutely, it's going to be a smaller demand for credit. It's interesting. We've had, and people are going to be way more pickier, because they're going to say, if I'm going to take on this debt, I'm going to make sure it's a quality asset, something I'm going to be super happy with, that I can live in long term. We also thought that we would have more investors. I think investors have been spooked. I think late last year, we saw this sort of, gradual increase in investors from literally non-existent for a few years. But I think this year it's sort of slowed down again. I think a lot of investors have been spooked as well by, interest rates increasing. They've got to pay a lot more for those assets. They can't afford lots of markets because, all the capital cities went up and a lot of the regions. So it's, buying prices a lot more, interest rates are a lot higher. Obviously the rents are going up, but that's, they're not really thinking like that. So I just think there's a massive drop in sort of demand. Interesting, our buyers this year haven't been new buyers. So, we've still been doing, big numbers, and our business is growing, quite dramatically over the last few years. But it's actually been the clients who have had multiple pre-approvals more than ever. It was the clients who missed out in 2020, missed out in 2021. And they've been able to sort of just jump in when the right property comes on. They know exactly what they're looking for. They've been able to take advantage of a bit of a nervous seller, like a seller that potentially would have went to auction last year, is happy to take that offer if it's, reasonable. I definitely think prices have already come off in our capital cities. We can, especially the markets that have been piggybacking off the most premium markets. So the ones that, potentially they're not the preference suburb, but they were because everyone had FOMO. Everyone was just willing to go further out. Talking to agents, they're already saying that they're off, 5-10%, which you can already see in figures. But what buyers are doing is they're just gravitating to that one or two listings that's a quality asset. And they're just trying to compete on that. And you can already see some auction results on the weekend, like some of the quality properties still got big prices, etc. Because all the buyers flock to that asset. So I think that's what buyers are going to be. If they're going to take on big mortgages, and they're going to be pickier and patient, and they're going to wait for the right property. They're not just going to be in that FOMO, because they're not worried about price increases as well, like they were last year. So there's no urgency from buyers. But I guess on that though, we have got ridiculously low listings, at a national level. It's different suburbs and different danger zones. Absolutely, there's already a listing problem growing, but overall, there's still pretty low supply. The other problem, I guess, is, I'm sorry for ranting, Martin, is that what in this sort of market, a lot of people are saying, well, I could have sold my property for X last year, but now it's X minus 5 or 10%. My whole idea of downsizing and moving to Southeast Queensland doesn't look as attractive because that's gone up. My house isn't going to sell as much. So I think, and also I can't afford to upgrade. The top end, what I wanted to upgrade ran further than and faster than my property. So a lot of upgraders are like, well, I wanted to upgrade last year when interest rates were 2%, but if they're going to be 3 or 4%, I don't know if I want to do that upgrade. And so quality listings, I think, are going to really start to dry up as well, because people don't want to downsize because they could have got a better price last year. And secondly, the higher interest rate's going to stop them sort of upgrading as well.
Yeah, very interesting. And look, one of the things I wanted to sort of pick up from there was this difference between houses, standalone houses on plots, and high-rise apartments, right? Because these are very, very different markets that we're seeing at the moment. And there is still, I think, you're right, some demand for quality properties on plots, standalone houses. We're seeing it down here in the region where I'm at, down in the Illawarra still. People are still coming out from Sydney and buying and paying over the odds, outpricing locals, right? But it's not the same in the apartment market that I'm seeing. I'm seeing a very different story there. I mean, what are you seeing? Are you seeing it?
We've never been a fan of high density, high rise apartments. And, you can go back to any of the episodes on this and you can see that I've always been trying to avoid, a lot of first home buyers entering there just out of the FOMO and those are the apartments that haven't gone up in the boom. It's been a profitless boom for them. If not, they've lost money, some of these apartments. Think Parramatta, Epping, Waterloo, in Sydney, apartments all over Melbourne and Brisbane, etc. I mean, investors don't really want to go there. A lot of first home buyers understand that they're not great assets now. You've got a lot of supply coming. The veil's been lifted, I guess. And I think, people are willing to go. In the past, people, being close to the city and the commute time was number one important. So if they had to compromise into an apartment because they could get to and from work easy, now clients are willing to go further than ever. We've had clients buy all up the coast. Even first home buyers are willing to go, 45 minutes to an hour and a half away from the city. But if you look prior to COVID, they wouldn't do that. They would have just said, look, I've got to get to the city. And that was supporting the apartment market. No migration as well. That's a massive factor into the apartment market as well, that would be supporting that because they would just be wanting to buy the city and they wouldn't know what they're doing a little bit. And so, obviously the apartment market, the big risk really, obviously, in the mortgage stress is that anyone who, took out a lot of debt in the last 2 years, and, had a very little deposit. And, and they're potentially at a stage of life. So young families, maybe one income, maybe one part-time. And, they took a risk, I guess. They got their first home. They took on a lot of debt. They maybe got a 90% loan. And they bought in an area where there's lots of other people taking on big loans at 90%. So house and land packages, etc. They're the issues when you start to see debt stress. Some people start forced selling. You start to see fire sales. Everyone sort of sits back, and you start to see that too much supply play out.
Yeah, and we're already seeing that in some pockets. So certainly from my data, prices already down in some of those new areas. And just to tell the old story once again, if you buy a home loan package, your property is new when you buy it, but as soon as you've bought it, it's no longer new. And in the next suburb, they're building more new stuff, right? That's what people are now beginning to realise. There isn't a hell of a lot of growth necessarily after that. In fact, prices tend to go backwards for quite a long period. The other point, though, I'm seeing that some of those people were highly leveraged with their mortgage as well, It's part of the government schemes and partly not. But they've got really big mortgages, no capital appreciation, and now the prospect of higher repayments. It's all going the wrong way.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been quite shocked, actually, because low interest rates really encouraged everyone to sort of buy, right? It was a massive spike in demand. No one sort of could foresee how much demand, 2% interest rates would create. But it really pushed up the whole market, not just the top end obviously went through the roof. The middle upper end obviously went up a lot as well. But the real affordable part of the market went up a lot. A lot of people thought now's the time to finally buy. They scraped their deposit together. They weren't traveling. They could save some money. And, that's the real danger zone, because they probably shouldn't have gone up anywhere near as much as they did. You think about the outskirts of Brisbane, the outskirts of Sydney and Melbourne, etc. And they were driven off people going, look, I want to, take on that debt because interest rates are low, and there's that FOMO. I think that's going to completely reverse the other way. And if you get people forced selling, people are going to want to sit on their hands. It's not like there's a shortage of options. And that's what's really hit the apartment market, is that every time they go to look at an apartment, they go, well, why would I rush? There's 10 others that are similar to this that I could buy. Why would I go and pay overs for that? I'm going to wait for the agent to come to me. And then so you're not getting any higher prices. And so, absolutely. I mean, it makes common sense, but people understand that with new property, but they fall for all this depreciation, and they get sold the dream, and they just focus on it's cheap and it's going to cover its face and all that sort of stuff. And it's a dangerous thing that just keeps on playing out.
And of course, federal government members of parliament and politicians were providing all sorts of financial advice to people, saying, great time to buy, you should get in the market, etc., right? So I chuckle with all this worry from ASIC about, the spruiking from some of the investment managers, but they don't do anything about the politicians and their spruiking.
Yeah, and the stamp duty concessions and things like that, they are targeted at lower price points. That forces people to go into the more affordable markets. And, you can see that those markets have been pushed up from purely state government incentives. Now that those markets have got too expensive for the state government incentive, then the buyers all need much bigger deposits. And so that's another thing I can see out, especially in sort of the outskirts of Brisbane. I was looking at some So I was like, how is that possible? I've gone up so much. And the factors are unfortunately are starting to flip the other way. A lot of investors as well in the apartment market have had a lot of pain, Martin. You've seen it in your surveys. We've had lots of clients who have, fallen for an apartment in Brisbane or Melbourne or something. They want to be out of it. They've had years of stress, let alone the vacancy issues, but, they can just see the opportunity cost of if they made a better decision, They look at what if they bought a house versus an apartment, or if they just put money into shares or whatever it might be, right? And, if they can get there, there's always this loss aversion, and, so they might have bought the apartments for, say, 500 and it's been down at 400 or 450. As soon as they can get their money back, not even stamp duty, to be honest, it's just a dollar value, they'll want to get out. And so what you'll see is if there's any type of recovery in the apartment market, for example, where investors are, or there's certain investor hotspots where, they bought them, they realized a few years later that they weren't going up anywhere near as much as what they probably should have bought. So they're no longer in contact with that buyer's agent or that, that person that sold them at 300,000. But they've been surprised with the growth over the last year because it's been driven by, first home buyers. They're getting out. they're like, I know the writing's on the wall, interest rates, etc. And that's going to also, so you've got people who are going to sell because it's higher interest rates. You're also going to get the investors out. So there's these real danger zones where investors are quite heavily in the market that would love to just get out if there's any sign of fear.
Absolutely. Well, let's just focus on interest rates for a little bit longer. Cookie Boy asked about Goldman Sachs is saying the Fed could be at 3 to 3.25% tops, which is not as high as some people, but it's still a long way up from where they are. And so I guess there's two questions. One is, if the Fed lifts rates, how does that flow through to Australia? But also, then secondly, what are you saying to people locally when they come and talk to you about at the moment? What rates should people be thinking about in their heads that, over the next 2 or 3 years you should be planning for?
Look, I think 4% is a good number. I think, if you are looking at variable rates right now at 2%, 1.99 we're getting at Westpac, for example. And so you're talking a 2% increase in interest rates. And there's also going to be a hell of a lot of competition, and all the banks are losing, market share, not to online lenders really, but, to places like Macquarie and ING and et cetera. And they're all going to be worried about credit growth. They're all got shareholders that they need to satisfy, et cetera. They've also got 500 billion, let's call it, of fixed loans expiring in the next couple of years. So competition's going to be rife. Mortgage brokers, this is not a plug for mortgage brokers, but the percentage of loans going through brokers is higher than ever. It's 2 in 3 loans now. And so, next couple of years, a lot of people going to brokers. There'll be great deals out there. So competition will still be really, really tight, I imagine. So even if the RBA sort of increases it to 2%, you'd like to say, hopefully that, variable rates are around 4%. Competition's sort of similar. And so I think that's a good number to use. Now, whether it gets that high and how fast it gets there, you should try to factor in that you can afford it on those rates. And that's what we're sort of suggesting to clients.
Right. And just to re-emphasize again what I said earlier on, right? So the move from, 1% or 1.99% to 4%, that's quite a big monthly repayment lift, right? I think people would be surprised if they put those numbers into the calculators and just saw how much payments went up. And the reason is, when rates are so low, the incremental movement has a huge impact on the interest that you're paying, and that's why the monthly repayments are going up.
Yes, there's a few things to that, Martin. So firstly, extending loan terms is something that we often do with clients. Just resetting loans to 30 years, it reduces repayments. They've got offset accounts, so they're still saving at the same rate. They're just building up money in offset accounts. The offset accounts is the second point. I mean, a lot of people know that rates are 2%, but they're already starting to build up money in cash. You can see all the numbers show there's hundreds of billions of dollars in offset accounts and savings, et cetera, that Australians have been building up over the last couple of years. And so, I think that'll help to cushion the buffer. So if you can't refinance and you can't extend your loan term and you can't get cash out to help you with the repayments and all that sort of stuff, because you haven't got a job and you haven't gone and saved, absolutely there's going to be those risks out there. But, it's not going to be across the whole country. It's not going to be every property in every suburb. If you just look at the numbers, a lot of properties are paid off. 30-40% of the properties are paid off. We've got $10 trillion of property values, which is crazy. That was only 7 a few years ago. But, and there's only $2 trillion of debt. So, the LVR across the whole country is 20%. But in certain pockets, it'll be 70, 80, 90%. And so you just got to be, conscious that, this whole thing could play out, but that doesn't mean you're going to see a massive increase in supply of houses in the suburb that you want to buy. It might be an increase, but that could also be offset by opportunistic buyers. You've got people that are wanting to get out of apartments that love to get into houses. There's pent up demand there. You've got people, first-time buyers that are saving, that are doing well financially now, they've got good incomes, that are getting to that life stage and want to get their first place. You've got migration coming, et cetera. So, so if there is an increase in supply for selling, I think that'll also be offset by a lot of people saying it's not a good time to sell as well. You could also see a demand. So, which is what kind of happened, in sort of 2019, very low supply. It was really hard to buy a good property in early 2019. No one was selling a good asset because why would you? The Sydney market was down 15%. Things shifted after the election, the cuts in borrowing capacity, the cuts in rates, the removal, the fear around sort of, Royal Commission had gone, and then bang, demand went through the roof on very low supply and the market jumped on people. It really surprised people. So you just got to be very careful trying to wait for this perfect storm to get a quality asset. It's actually really hard to buy good assets in down markets.
Yes, Austin. Trying to pick the window, of course, is quite difficult. Now, there's a couple of questions that come in. This one is quite good. In the US, I can lock in a fixed mortgage for 30 years. Is there such projects in Australia? And so why is there a 30-year fixed rate loan in America? These two markets are fundamentally structured differently, aren't they? Which is why we've effectively, you won't see a fixed 30-year rate here, will you?
No, and our fixed rates have really gone now. Like the window has closed. And, we were getting, obviously everyone knows you're getting fixed rates sub 2% for, even at 5 years, you could get, 1.89, I think was some of the lowest rates, or 1.79. We had lots of clients fixed for, 3 and 4 years at, around 1.8, 1.9%. All the fixed rates are out of market now. It's all about the variable rate and how big discount you can get locked into your loan contract. And that margin between existing customers and new customers is enormous. Like, we're talking 70, 80, 90 basis points, where if you had a mortgage more than, 1 to 3 or 4 years old, your rate is so far out of market. Banks are really competing really hard for existing customers and obviously not calling you up and saying, hey, I can give you a better deal. So, that's something that a lot of people will do. Will help soften their repayment jump as well. If they can just reduce their interest rate through refinancing or just even, threatening to leave their bank, that will also reduce a lot of the challenges with increasing interest rates.
Absolutely. Now, one or two people have said, well, hang on, you're talking about Sydney. Let me just throw this at you. One of the other questions I had beforehand was somebody looking at investment properties and looking at Brisbane and Queensland saying, well, the yields seem a lot higher up there relative to Sydney or indeed Melbourne. Are you seeing many people thinking about those markets? And how different are Brisbane markets from Sydney markets? And are you seeing any drift away from Sydney towards Brisbane and the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast in Queensland?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, that ship it hasn't to say it's fully sailed, but it's definitely well on its way. I mean, yields are great up there. If you think yields are great today, they were amazing sort of 4 or 5 years ago. We did a valuation for a client literally yesterday. I mean, they bought in, inner north, a 670 of Melbourne, 4Ks from the city, a beautiful Queenslander on a good street. That's Val came back yesterday at 1.2. That was 4 years. We had lots of clients buying in Brisbane, houses that suit higher income families that are on good blocks of land that are really close to the city around good schools and lifestyle, and that are actually quite, aspirational, right? For where if you're doing well in Brisbane, you'd love to live there. Or even if you were doing well in Sydney or Melbourne, you look at those properties and say, I'd love to live there if I was living in Brisbane. And we were getting clients buying, from 700 to 1.1 million. All those properties are probably up 60 to 90%, and, that's what people are moving. If they're making interstate migration, if you're leaving from Sydney, Melbourne, you look at these suburbs, the locals are upgrading into these suburbs, etc. So, yeah, absolutely, you can bet on Brisbane. My advice would be is don't bet on the middle and outer rings because they're being driven by affordability. They're being driven by low rates. Now, if affordability is starting to get stretched, let alone with inflation, but also because of higher rates, I think your growth's sort of gone. If you're going to bet on Brisbane, you want to bet on something. If someone's it's still comparatively quite cheap and affordable and an option for people leaving Sydney, Melbourne to move to Brisbane. But you're talking, $1.5, $2 million to get into these sort of suburbs now. It's not, 900,000, which it was just a few years ago.
Absolutely. And, one of the other questions that has come up a few times is, well, if you look at different areas of Brisbane, Sunshine, Gold Coast, right, there are lots of different types of property in different locations. But this flood thing, the flood event, has really put some people on notice, right? And of course, the flood event hit a lot of the areas around Brisbane and right the way down New South Wales and to Sydney. What was your sort of reaction to the flood event, and what do you think it's going to do to the property market overall?
I do feel for the Brisbane buyers last year that maybe they haven't done their due diligence. Maybe they didn't do their flood map. Maybe they just went, she'll be right, mate. It's 1 in 100 years when it was 2 in 10 years or whatever it was, or 11 years. When the market's emotional and it's FOMO, which it really was in Brisbane late last year, people were just doing silly things, just the pressure to buy was so high. And unfortunately, there'll be a lot of people that, less than 6 months after they've owned properties, they paid a premium price, and the demand for those properties is going to fall through the floor. People can't really list them because they can't sell them because they need to do the repairs, etc. But it's a real tricky situation. Building costs are obviously through the roof. Insurance is probably nowhere near enough. And so, I really feel for all those families, to be honest. I mean, to be honest, what it'll actually do, though, the buyers that were in Brisbane pre-flood are still in Brisbane, but they potentially just feel like they've just got let out of jail because they were going to look at some areas that probably did flood. And what they've done is they've shifted their brief. They said, God, we lucky we got away with that. Let's look at these suburbs that are a bit higher, that are unlikely to flood. And they didn't flood, in those just recently. And so what it's doing is shifting those buyers to those other suburbs where there's already low listings. People are less likely to sell out of those suburbs as well because they know that they're good suburbs now. And so you're going to see this real sort of two-speed market, which is what's happened after the last floods. It's going to take a long time for those other properties to come back. And, do they come back like they did after the last flood, or are people more aware around some of the reasons what caused it? And,
So one of the questions that came in beforehand, and it's in the chat now, is when you're thinking of buying a property, to what extent should the vendor be forced to disclose some of these potential risks, like flooding risk, versus is it down to you as the prospective buyer to basically just, caveat emptor? You find it all out for yourself. It's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it?
Property market's unregulated for a reason, and the government doesn't want to go anywhere near this. Because what they want to do is just more transaction stuff, and they're not here to protect the consumer. They could do lots of things to protect the consumer. So absolutely, it's buyer beware. Don't rely on anyone looking to protect you. You've got to do all your due diligence, all your checks. A client was going to buy a block of land today in Perth, for example, and the agent was saying you could build this on it and you can do that. And I'm like, it's a pretty narrow block. It's a good suburb, but it's going to be tough to get access and blah, blah, blah. And I'd be calling council, checking there's any, et cetera. And so I'm coming at it from there's a lot of risk in this. I think it's not a block that most people want, hence why it hasn't sold. And he's looking at it, well, actually, no, it's really hard to get a block in Perth. I just want to build my dream house. I'll make it work. I'm not in a rush, etc. So he was trying to just listen to the agent, and I'm just looking at the other way going, for me, it looks very risky. And so you've got to go into things eyes wide open because the cost of transacting property are enormous, let alone the risk of, selling it at a lower price, or the opportunity cost, or the stress, or the emotional strain on relationships. These are big decisions.
Yeah, and I've said, and I keep saying, you have to do all the legwork. You can't take anything that the agent says as gospel, right? They will be representing the property as best able it can be represented, with a big slice of marketing spin and everything else, and a lot of enthusiasm. You have to actually play the hard ball and the counterfactual. So think about bushfires, flooding, structure, etc., etc. And a lot of people, that I have on my one-on-one conversations, when I start talking about this, their eyes roll. And it's getting hard, isn't it? Yes, it is. This is not easy, right?
Absolutely. It's like one of my little property sayings, hard to buy, easy to sell. It actually should be hard. Yes, you can get lucky. The dream property on a great street can come on your lap and it's easy to buy. That's not going to happen. The reality is if a dream property is out there and it's a great asset, you're not the only one looking for it. And the agent's not just going to call you up and say, hey, here you go, here's on the plate. It should be hard to buy. It should be hard to find it. You should know that, there's only about 3 properties like this have sold in this suburb over the last 3 years, which ticks all the boxes, right? And, it's, you know, if it goes, you'll miss out on a few because it's just you can't get that contract done because it'll go to auction and it'll go to a silly price. And it's a tough thing to sort of pull off, get a quality asset and get the contract. You know, that's why we work with a lot of buyers agents that are very local area specific. They've got the relationships with the agents to try to get an edge. That's not one company. That would be, we refer to lots of them but individual different pockets around the city. So it's hard to buy. The good news is once you've done all that due diligence, and even when you fall in love with the property, you get a building report and you're like, oh no, you know, they've sort of just lipstick on a pig. You know, it's something wrong with it, fundamentals. Can't fix that. I can't change that. The unknown, it could be a lot of money. We don't know about that. We can't afford to take that risk. Next property. So it really is that process of elimination. No to most things. When the right property comes up, you try to secure it at a fair price. You're never going to get it as a great price. You know, the vendor knows it's a good property. And that's, you know, because they've had agents hounding them, you know, promising them way more than what the market's potentially going to offer them. So it's hard to negotiate with those agents. It's just about getting it for a fair price, even potentially above what you think it's worth, because that's the only one who's the one who does that's the one who gets it. And putting all your eggs in quality, because that's what's going to protect you.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, we've always talked about the dogs and the stars, you know, the ones that actually make sense and the ones that don't make sense. And, you know, once you start looking at a few properties, you start quite quickly begin to see the difference between the stars and the dogs, right? And that's partly location, partly design, partly condition, all of those things can make a huge difference. But, you know, the fact is that if you are seriously pursuing property or properties, you may end up having to pay for, you know, reports on multiple properties, right? And you may have to walk away because there's something that is significant and you can't deal with. That is just part of the journey.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's actually, you should feel happy that you paid $400 on a building and pest and it found out that issue. You know, it was a couple of years ago, I was in love with the property. We went there, got the building and pest done. There's a retaining issue problem that was unknown. It was holding up part of the house. And it was hard to drag myself back emotionally and say, right, well, this is not the right property. This could be a few $100,000 potentially that would completely mean that we're going to overcapitalize in this. We're already going to have to pay a good price. That probably ended up going for a big price at auction. And so the person buying it wasn't factoring that into their decision. And so, yeah, absolutely. It is a tough slog. You should be willing to. The hard part is new buyers to a suburb. So if you live in a suburb and you're growing up in a suburb, you know that that's a rat run. You know that that's busy. You know that there's a school there. You know it's always a pain at peak hour. You know that there's a smell in that part of the suburb. You know that there's certain type of housing and there's privacy problems and there's flights and noise because you've been to a friend's house. So when you're a local buyer, you get that sort of understanding that you'd love to be on that street, because when you walk the dog, you go, oh God, this is such a nice street. It's so quiet and, you know, etc. So the locals know that, right? And so you definitely want a property that the locals love. But that's hard when you're a new buyer. So those properties transact much lower number than the busy roads. You can track any suburb and you'll see the busy roads turn over a lot more because people buy there. They go, oh, God, this wasn't what I thought it was. I'm going to shift into another property if I can. But when you're a new buyer into the suburb, they're the ones the agents love because they're buying the suburb, they're buying the lifestyle, and they don't factor in all those other fundamentals that the locals do.
Absolutely right. A few people were quite amused at your comment about the smell of that part of the suburb, and it's serious. I used to, years ago in the UK, I used to live in Northamptonshire, and I discovered that the next town down was actually a glue factory. Right, and they actually basically boiled up the bones and made glue out of them. And if the wind was in the wrong direction, boy, you knew about it. Now, you know, the locals said, well, we've always had that. That's just an example, right? If you didn't happen to visit that particular area on the right day, I was renting at the time, so it wasn't a real problem. You know, you could be caught, and that then is something that you've got to live with.
Well, absolutely. Think about flight plus, right? You know, last couple of years, nowhere near as many flights as there should be, or, you know, usually is. And I mean, you know, you're completely, you know, thinking, oh, maybe it's only one every 15 minutes, but it's one every 4 minutes, and they start at 6 a.m. and they're going straight over your house. You just weren't there at that time. So let alone school and traffic and rat runs, etc. That have a lot of buyers haven't been factoring that into their decisions. And 2022 is a bit different to the last couple of years.
And the older adage is no point just going and looking at a property on a quiet Sunday afternoon or a Saturday morning, right? You have to go there during the week, right? And go there during the evening as well, and just see what it's like at other times, because quite often you'd be completely deceived if you actually went there just on a Saturday morning.
It's hard work, Martin, and that's what a lot of clients do, and I really encourage them to do that, especially if it's parts of suburbs they don't know very well. But then they get busy, and things are happening, etc. And they're making, sometimes multi-million-dollar decisions, looking at a property once at the perfect time for that property. When the agent arranged the openings for inspection, or the agent said, no, I can't do it at 4 o'clock because he knows it's not going to look great. And they push you into the time that's perfect for the sun, etc. So absolutely. You want to basically go and try to convince yourself not to buy the property, not looking to fall in love with the property again, because that's easy. You're trying to find things that, turn you off the property. Check the neighbours, go around the back of the property, look at your privacy, look at what may change with council over time. Just keep on thinking about things why you shouldn't buy the property. And if there is a reason that something you can change, well, that's fine. But if it's something you can't change, it needs to be factored into the price. We had a client trying to look at a property today. It presents amazing. It's like a north-facing house in a good suburb in Sydney, and it's at a fair price compared to it's definitely underquoted, but it's not on a great road. And this client's just in love with the property, and so what they're going to do is basically factoring how much is that road discounting the price. If that was on a better street, how much more would they be paying? What's some other, and getting those real past sales to go, well, yeah, it's a great property, but in down markets, or the market does, and people aren't willing to compromise on busier roads, are they protected because they bought really well at a cheaper price?
Absolutely. And Cookie Boy, I just said, look when it's raining, right? That'll tell you some stuff that's quite useful too. Don't just go on a sunny day, right?
Yeah, it's pretty easy at the moment, isn't it?
I was going to say you're more likely to be in the rain rather than in the sun. Now, I had a couple of questions beforehand, and in fact, this also came in on the chat as well. People are sort of trying to get their head around the other costs, because when you buy, everybody knows that there's probably stamp duty, depending on it, but there's a bunch of other costs that often people don't think about. So can we just go through some of those and just get, not chapter and verse, but a rough quantum? What are the sorts of buckets of money that you need to be thinking about if you are going to transact?
Look, you need a deposit for the bank. Ideally a 10% deposit is probably the minimum, because then the mortgage insurance isn't ridiculous. Ideally a 12% deposit, then your mortgage insurance drops a bit. I mean, obviously in the dream world, you've got a 20% deposit, right? And more than that, the better, right? But ideally a 10 or a 12% deposit for the bank. The other cost is, I just wrap them up into one cost. And I just say it's around 5%. In Victoria, it's a little bit higher. Stamp duty is a bit more expensive down there. And the more expensive properties can be 6 or 7% as well. But, if you just factor in 5% for your cost, which includes your stamp duty, you will have a few thousand left over potentially, which is a good thing because you want a small buffer, right? So I would, you definitely don't want to be going near a property if you haven't got 15% times the purchase price, assuming you can't, get stamp duty concessions or something like that. The cost you've really got, you've got legal costs, maybe a couple of grand for conveyancing. Just be careful falling for the all-in 990 or 690, or I've seen it for before. Those conveyances, you've got to think about who's actually looking at that contract. That's actually quite an important part of the process, to make sure that they know what they're doing. They're not just sort of ticking all the boxes, and so they've got to do it efficiently for 690. Secondly, when the settlement happens, they go AWOL on you. It gets very stressful. One little delay or a mistake wipes out that cheap deal with conveyancing. So be really careful with low-cost providers. You've got building and pest is probably your other big one. And then potentially a buyer's agent to sort of help you if you can afford it and into your suburb. But I'd just say 5% for your cost for your purchase. That's probably a good number for people to really easily think about in their head, rather than trying to total up every single cost, prior to settlement. If you do 5%, it probably covers everything. Yeah,
I think that's a good rule of thumb. And I absolutely endorse your point about conveyancers, there's a mechanical part to conveyancing, which essentially is just moving the paperwork around and getting things signed, right? But that isn't what you should be paying for, right? There's a whole bunch of other questions like risk assessment and make sure that nothing has been missed. So, for example, easements and those sorts of things can actually, really hit you later. And in fact, when I bought a property in Sydney, I ended up reading the documentation and discovered stuff that the conveyancer hadn't picked up, right? And that was to do with the fact that there was an easement because our drainage system went through the neighbour's garden, effectively, so we didn't have any direct access to the sewer. And so I basically said, well, hang on a moment, I want that changed. So I actually renegotiated so I could put the sewer directly down and have control of it. Now, the conveyancer hadn't picked that up, and I asked the question, why hadn't he? Well, that's just the way it was. It was like, you should have told me that.
Yeah, like I said before, you can't outsource your risk to anyone. You're the one who's responsible for this. Yeah, you've gone and hired a conveyancer. Yeah, you've gone and picked a good one. But the good ones are also busy. Yeah, they're probably charging more because they've got that experience, so they're able to do things much more efficiently. They're able to spot things that are issues. They're able to, converse with you in an efficient manner because they know what's important to tell you rather than things that aren't. But absolutely, you want to be going through things. You want to be going through the easements and the title and just seeing if there's any issues that you can pick out and ask questions if you're in doubt because you're the one taking on that loan and putting all your deposit in. So, absolutely. Yeah, it's all about personal accountability with this decision.
And the other point I'd make is that if you get a building report and those things, it's worth reading the small print in those reports as to what they actually haven't done. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Because quite often what you'll discover is they'll say, well, we couldn't move the furniture or we couldn't look here, couldn't look there. So quite often it's really, really important to understand what exclusions they've actually included in the report. And quite a few of them have a fairly standard report which basically has thousands and thousands and thousands of exclusions and get out of jail sort of clauses as well.
Yeah.
You got to go through that process.
Yeah, I mean, we use a few different ones, but I mean, one guy that we use in Sydney is that, when the client does use, and we agree that they're going to have a phone conversation straight away after or when they're at the property, and they can do FaceTime, etc. But, they just, that builder gives us his honest opinion. What he puts in the report and what he says on the phone is completely different. It's the soft facts. It's the, he's seen lots and lots of properties. He knows things that are average or below standard or things that are big issues or unknowns and things he hasn't checked. And that's where I think you get the gold out of that $450 or whatever it is. It's that conversation. It might only be 5 minutes or 2 minutes, but that's the report itself is just so full of disclaimers. It's not really too much to read in there. It's good to reference back to in the future, to be honest. You can look at their photos. They've got a good list, and you can sort of just check off, making sure that anything that, because sometimes you buy a property, you forget that there was issues with it, and years later you're like, they're actually, important maintenance issues. So that's definitely, I think, why building reports can be handy.
And you've actually just segued wonderfully into a question that I had from before the show, which was, this is a couple who moved in about 2 years ago into their property. It's not a brand new one. It's a sort of a second-hand. I think it's about 12 years. They said, we've been surprised by the maintenance costs of just keeping a property up together, right? We hadn't factored any of that into our budgeting. So we'd sort of naively assumed that, the property, relatively new, so a bit of paint here and there, but that's about it. But they're actually up for quite significant ongoing maintenance costs. What do you say to people? I mean, do you get into those conversations when they're actually thinking about what they can afford to budget to buy, or is that sort of beyond the curve, as it were?
Not on an individual level, but if you haven't bought a property before, it can surprise you, especially just things like painting, updating windows, and obviously we should be having a building boom at the moment, right? We had a renovation boom for the last couple of years, but we should have had a massive building boom in the next few years, but obviously all the issues around wages and materials, etc. And so, if you aren't factoring these in, and then you've got to do renovations, and the only way you can sell is doing those renovations, and you can get really caught out because that's one of the problems with going down the quantity strategy and people buying cheaper houses in the fringes is if you go and spend 30 grand on a roof on a $300,000 house, well, that wipes out 10% of your gain. Not say the roof's 30 grand, but you know what I mean? So maintenance can really hit people with the quantity strategy because they go into cheaper markets, they go into cheaper properties, and then the maintenance wipes out a lot of their growth. It means sometimes it's tax deductible. Yeah, it doesn't mean they pay capital gains tax, but that's assuming they make a profit in the first place. So maintenance can really hit you, and it's something that's not factored in. I mean, it's like a lost cost. Interest is the same. That's what you should be caring. If your mortgage repayments are $6,000 a month, what you should care about is what portion of that is interest. What am I going to lose each month? Let's say it's 3. And then what is my cost in insurance? Insurance can smash people as well. And what is my cost with maintenance? Not adding any value to it, just maintaining status quo. It's not going to give us a better sale price because when I bought the property, it was a fresh paint, and I need to sell it as fresh paint to obviously sell the same product. So it is a big thing that's not factored into any price growth. It really takes out a lot of the profits that people think they've made.
And I'll just add on to that. An investment property has precisely the same issues attached to it, right?
Yeah.
And quite often investors don't think about that. So when I measure gross and net returns, the net return is also essentially the cost of actually keeping the property together, right? That's the one you should be looking at, the net return, not the gross return, which is just the price versus the theoretical gross net rental that you can get. That's a meaningless number, right? The net rental, the net return is actually the critical one because, again, costs continue. An investment property needs to be looked after.
Yeah, I mean, we're not ever been big fans of this positive cash flow strategy. We know that what you get is a higher risk asset. It's got less chance, from a supply point of view. It's got the flaws with demand in terms of its affordability market. It's where people are willing to pay a lot of rent, but they're not wanting to pay a lot to buy the property, or they can't afford to buy the property. And so we've never been a fan of trying to build portfolios based on income. It's just a flawed strategy. But then what actually smashes them as well is they get excited about this 6% yield, then they get vacancy, then they have maintenance problems, etc. And then rents don't go up over 5 or 6 years because they can't go up because incomes aren't going up. And so the yield just flatlines, whereas I'd much prefer to pay a lower yield, get a lower yield today, but then rent increases and no vacancy. And maintenance costs aren't as prolific because I'm in one property rather than 3 properties. And I did a really good building and pest up front. I know that, it's in a pretty good, standard today. There's nothing that's, should happen in the short term.
Absolutely. Very important points. Now, I had a couple of people ask about how you find a buyer's agent. This was one for Perth, but I had a couple of other questions beforehand. People find it quite difficult to know how to go about finding a buyer's agent. I mean, there's no sort of easy answer, unfortunately, is there, Chris?
I typed in the Google the other week, property investing. I was just curious to see what will come up. And, unfortunately, it's all the serial offenders, right? The government housing, the studios, this quantity sort of strategy, high cash flow, new property. There's all these serial offenders that you'll get in there. And, there's usually not great buyer's agents in there as well. So, when people type that into Google, the people who are paying for all the AdWords and are doing all the SEO are all these sort of property marketing companies pushing spruiking strategies. And so you're right, it is quite hard. I mean, a good resource is REBA. So that's the Buyers Agents Institute. To get to be a part of that, you can't sort of buy a new property. You can't take cashbacks and kickbacks from sort of developers. I think you've got to be a buyer's agent for 2 years. I think there's about maybe 80 or 100 members. And I think the most important thing is, experience matters in the type of property that you're trying to buy. So there's no point going and getting, someone who's just starting out and they just want to have a crack at it. They haven't got the thing you're buying is the knowledge, which is going to be limited because they're just starting out. The second thing you're trying to buy is that relationship with the agent. Now, and they call the agent and they say, okay, I'm John, I'm a new buyer's agent in the area. Okay, John, I've already got 4 or 5 other buyer's agents that I would always go to first over you. Come back and see me in a few years' time. And a lot of the new buyer's agents, one of the challenges of starting new jobs and new professions and new businesses is that reputation takes years to build. And so what you want to do is have a buyer's agent that's been doing it a long time. Not many have been doing it a long time, but it's been doing it a long time in that patch, and it's got great relationships with agents. And they're worth the fee. A lot of the other buyer's agents, I don't know what you're paying for. A lot of them are just messengers. They call the agent up, they say $1 million. They call a client, say they'll sell it for $1 million. And then you go, okay, I'll pay $1 million. And then they just get charged their fee along the way. It's probably a bit harsh, but unfortunately, that's what a lot of buyer's agents do.
Exactly right. And it is tough to find a really good one. But, a really good one can make a difference on occasions. But it does depend, I think, also on the type of property you're going after and to what extent you personally know the area. If you don't know the area, that may be something else to consider. But it's not easy. Really isn't easy at all.
Absolutely. If you can afford it and you're getting the best buyer's agent in that pocket, and they've got great relationships with agents, that fee will most likely be the difference between you getting the property or not. Like, without doubt, we've been working with them for a decade. We're completely sold on the value of the top buyers agents in the area. There's something that happens through the transaction. It may be getting the contract. It may be hearing about the property first. It may be a bit of knowledge that allows you to negotiate a bit better. It may be a favour that the agent gives the buyer's agent. That happened to our client last week. And so there's all these other things that happen that mean that you're the one with the signed contract. It doesn't mean you're going to get it for a cheaper price, but you're the one who's got it, not the other 6 bidders or not the other 4 or 5 people that are making offers. And so time and time again, the top buyer's agents prove their value somewhere through the transaction. It could be the conversation as well. They were thinking about 2 different properties. The buyer's agent was carefully able to convince them not to buy that type of property for these reasons from a growth point of view, even though they're in love with it. Let's look at this property. And so a lot of that's that coaching along the journey as well of what not to buy that good buyer's agents do.
I love that point about what's not to buy, which is turning the whole conversation on its head, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, right? There's 10 million properties that's called out there. Would you buy 10 million properties? Absolutely not. It's a small fraction of those.
Now, let's sort of push the conversation a bit further forward, because there's going to be an election in the next couple of months, right? We had, in the last few days, announcements from the government on broker. The broker review isn't going to happen now, so the Royal Commission is again, another damp squib, so commissions will be kept pretty much as they are. And there was also the housing affordability report that came out last Friday, which effectively was looking at supply side issues. And there were some interesting observations there. Things like they're not going to do anything on negative gearing. They're going to allow people to use superannuation. And more broadly, Chris, what are they going to do, do you think, to try and keep the property bubble bubbling away? Because they don't want prices to slide, do they?
Okay, so just on the broking thing, while I'm here, I'm going to be pro-broker, obviously. Brokers weren't going into the Royal Commission with massive complaints. Yes, there was issues around, the legislation around them wasn't tight enough. The ways that brokers could recommend loans wasn't in consumers' favour. They had to pick loans that were not unsuitable rather than the best interest. So things like that were tightened up. There was also issues in the broker remuneration system with volume-based bonuses and different lenders paying different amounts and issues around trail, etc. like that. A lot of those got tidied up as part of the, because what has happened in the Royal Commission, CBA, pretty much try to kill brokers because they know that they're losing market share. It's getting harder and harder every year. Turn them to a flat fee model. Consumers won't pay that. They'll go to branches, etc. That backfired. And brokers' market shares just continue to soar, which means more competition, which means better deals for customers. That's really the truth of that. And that's why it's not going ahead. And so the Royal Commission was a good thing for brokers. It really meant that there's best interest duties now, and it tidied up all these conflicts that didn't need to be there. The Falinsky report's a funny one. I was really excited about it. There was hundreds and hundreds of submissions. I didn't, take the time to do a submission. I don't know if you did, Martin, but there was a lot. It came out with this report pretty much saying that, we need to increase supply. We need to incentivize councils to increase supply. Yep, no joke. Good luck getting that past the NIMBYs. Let's increase demand. Let's first-home buyers, get access to their super. That'll increase affordability. No, it won't. It'll pump up demand. Let's not get rid of negative gearing. Okay, well, that keeps increasing demand for investors. Okay, let's not get rid of that. Let's change to land tax instead of stamp duty. Okay, well, that's just reduced the deposit hurdle for first home buyers, for investors, dramatically. Will they invest? Will they more likely buy? Absolutely. So, the supply issues are always hard. The developers control the market, the council and tax, etc. And then they're doing things that'll prop up sort of demand. So, what will they do to sort of increase demand? If the interesting thing, as interest rates go up, borrowing capacities fall. So when interest rates were falling, it was a double kick to the market. Borrowing capacities were going up, so you could borrow more money and you could borrow at a cheaper rate. When interest rates are going up, people want to borrow less, but also they can borrow less. The borrowing capacities will fall. So a 1% increase in interest rates will reduce borrowing capacities by about 10%. And that's a lot. So instead of being able to borrow 1.5 million, you can borrow 1.35 million. Plus, you've got to pay a higher interest rate. So what will they do? I think some changes around that will happen. I think that the assessment rate will drop, instead of being a buffer of 3%, or maybe it'll go back to 2.5, or apparently you can go back to 2. So that's one thing. Obviously encouraging first home buyers, the changes to stamp duty. They've got to get investors back in the market. The reality is, we've had years and years of investors not being in the market and a massive increase in home buyers. And it's taking a lot of rental stock off the market. And that's why we've got a rental crisis in lots of places around the country. So they do need to get investors back to sort of level that off a bit more. But yeah, there's lots of things. Payment holidays for places in debt stress. We were talking before we jumped on here, Martin. That shocked me when that happened in COVID. I was just like, wow, 6 months without paying your mortgage with no questions asked. And so things like that will start popping up. Who knows what's around the corner, but you and I both know that it's then there's no plans to reduce the value of the property market. It doesn't make any sense to the government, from consumer confidence to taxes to bank profits. The list goes on, right? The building industry, whatever they'll do. That doesn't mean the market they're just going to save the market. It doesn't mean they've got a real challenge with inflation. They're going to have to increase interest rates, but there's certain pockets that they're just going to have to let sort of play out. But they know it's not going to crash the whole market collectively.
No, well, it's interesting. The APRA basically has said we're looking at it from a financial stability perspective, and we don't think there's any issues there, right? Although they then claim they've got no responsibility for house prices. The Reserve Bank, of course, basically says, well, house prices nothing to do with us, despite the fact they said interest rates. And that's because there isn't a huge amount of connection between what they're doing and credit, unfortunately. And, the report didn't talk about the credit issues at all. And, as I keep saying, the real reason why we've got such big house prices is because people have been able to leverage themselves to the hilt, right? And that's going to definitely reverse now with interest rates rising. So you're right. I think it's quite likely that they will pull other levers to try and continue to allow people to be pulled forward into the market. But that means essentially that prices will not fall back. What it means is that people will get more leveraged. And that is just making a bigger problem even more significant. And, we've already got the highest debt probably around the world, maybe after Switzerland, for housing. And in the meantime, of course, people are spending a greater proportion of their income on borrowing those mortgages. The mortgages are 20% bigger than they were a couple of years ago on average, new ones. And interestingly, of course, if you think about it, with inflation rising, with rates coming up, and people are going to have less disposable income, which is with them a problem for the broader economy in terms of how they're going to keep that. And it's interesting that the Roy Morgan statistics that came out today on consumer confidence dropped again. And it dropped because of fears about inflation and fears about wages growth and things like that and the cost of living. So it's tricky. It'll be interesting to see whether they manage to pull those levers just to keep the bubble going a bit longer, or whether we are going to see a bit of a more significant correction now.
Absolutely. Credit growth is a huge part. It doesn't take a rocket science. If you can lend money, a lot more money out there, people will go and take it and they'll go and spend it, right? Whether it's consumer credit or housing credit. And so when it's relaxed, and it is quite relaxed, to be honest, it's very easy to get loans approved. We never get declined loans. We're not even having many arguments with credit assessors because they're looking at things too closely or forensically asking silly questions, which absolutely can be the case, especially if they're inexperienced and have only been doing it a few months, which all the banks have had massive increases in credit flows. They've all got a lot of inexperienced credit assessors, to be honest. We're quite often teaching them, no, this is what your policy says and this is how you should handle this situation. But absolutely, borrowing capacity is a huge impact on the market. And so when that got really hit in 2018, borrowing capacity was down dramatically because of living expenses. That's what caused the Sydney market to fall in the Melbourne market. It was the cut in borrowing capacity. Interest rates didn't do anything. It was just the cut in borrowing capacity. So absolutely, they'll try to increase borrowing capacity. HEM's gone up as well. So not only has the APRA change reduced borrowing capacities, but HEM's gone up as well last quarter, which it should. We all know the inflation issues. So borrowing capacity is actually probably down maybe 8%, maybe just some rough numbers sort of there. So they'll do ways to increase borrowing capacity. I think that's the big issue is when you've got everyone's taken on, maxed out their borrowing capacities on very low interest rates. And you can't encourage more people into the market because they're fearful. They're going to sit on their hands. The media sentiment's shifting, right? Why would you buy now? CBA saying 15% in the next couple of years. Chris Joy, really respected commentators, called the up and the down and then back the up. He's calling big falls as well. And you've got to listen when he says it. But I think that market's going to really struggle. The affordability markets, because of borrowing capacities, because of debt stress, etc. But, Martin, we see a lot of clients. We obviously work with a subset of the market. A lot of our clients are those sort of younger, sort of professional couples. Our average loan size is probably closer to 1.5 million, as a family. And, the clients that we see, we've seen some massive increases in salaries, in different industries and bonuses. And, and it's great for them and they've invested in their education and maybe a lot of it's luck and not always skill. And it's just a profession that they do. But there is a big cohort that are doing well financially. There's a lot of business owners that are doing well financially. And they're getting a lot of the, capitalism is what it is. They're getting, quite big increases. And so I think people can always forget that, I'm struggling, so everyone's struggling. And the vice versa, I'm doing really well, so everyone's doing really well. But there is a cohort that have, COVID's been quite friendly to their income and their business profits.
Absolutely. Well, I keep saying this 250 billion that people have meant to have saved, right? It's not equally spread across all households, right? It's sitting in about 15 to 20% of households predominantly. There's a bunch of others who have got no benefit at all from the last 2 or 3 years, right? And they're actually really struggling to get into the market, or they've got into the market but only just and hanging on by their fingernails. And it's that unequal distribution that I get a bit heated about, because what that means is that if the politicians are and the Reserve Bank is already all talking about that 250 billion and everybody's fine. No, it's not everybody. It's a proportion of the population, and it's completely skewed.
Oh, that's a really good point, Martin, actually. You're right. It's people have got heaps of cash and they've got properties and they've got no issues, etc. And then people are struggling, and I don't think that 250. And a lot of it's probably people who are at a stage in life where they're not going to re-enter property and they haven't got debt, etc. So it's not like the people who need that money have got those savings buffers. So I completely agree that it's probably the retirees, it's people who've had assets they've sold and their kids are out of home because that's why they were able to save so much, etc. And they had no debt issue anyway. So that buffer was a buffer on a buffer on a buffer. Yep. So I mean, I guess the thing to bang home is that it's actually hard to buy quality assets in times of uncertainty, and also whether it's shares or whatever it is, right? People don't want to sell, and residential property definitely, because people live in them. You can't just quickly sell your property. You've got to sleep there at night, right? And you don't want to sell because if you make the wrong decision and you sell and the market goes up, you look like an idiot, right? And you feel like an idiot. So you don't sell. You just sit on your hands because you don't want to be that person. And so, and you don't sell because you can't find another better property on the market. And so you get this sort of Mexican standoff of good properties. And so in these next few years, we've already got a very low listing of properties where people are stuck in properties. They'd love to upgrade or do something else, but they can't afford to do the upgrade, or if they couldn't afford to buy back into the suburb that they're in, and they're not ready to downsize down the coast because the coast has gone on through the roof, and their grandkids are around, etc. So good properties will be harder to buy. That's just naturally what will happen, and there'll still be a subset that are doing well financially that'll be opportunistic in that suburb. They're wanting to be in those suburbs. And so, it's going to be to think that you're going to be able to go and get a quality asset in the next couple of years at a great price. It's just wishful thinking, unfortunately. And so it's just about, but if you are buying, you've got to go for the quality right now, because when things cool off, it really hits the things that are compromised. We can already see that. The properties that are compromised right now that are on the market, they're the ones that are slower. They're the ones that are passing in. They're the ones that are, they're re-renting it out, that they're, or they're deciding to stay, and then they're maybe not moving down the coast anymore because they couldn't get what they wanted.
No, absolutely. And I also would just underscore the talk about migration, right? So migration is meant to pick up, although it's picking up pretty slowly at the moment. And of course, we've had zero real growth in terms of population in recent times, which is one of the other factors to throw in. But one of the interesting observations is a lot of people who migrate to Australia don't necessarily immediately buy property. They might go into the rental sector first. So that's the first and the factor. And the second factor to bear in mind is they don't necessarily flow equally across all of the parts of Australia. So we might well see particular areas where migration could help a little bit. And then overlay that with the bigger conversation about, well, how big should Australia be? Because the forward projections that everyone's running are significantly higher than what we've actually seen over the last couple of years, which is an interesting observation. So all this property growth in terms of price is the time when migration has gone nowhere.
Yeah, and I mean, we spoke about that a couple of years ago, and I remember saying when, I don't think the migration thing is going to be a big impact on the market. And I said for those reasons as well. It doesn't, they don't buy straight away, but that lag is still accruing, right? People moving here, from overseas, whether they can't even get finance or whether they've got the savings, they've moved here and they spent everything on getting here. Yep. And maybe, Australia's a very expensive country, right? And look at the deposit you need to get into the housing market here. So yeah, you can get a job in Australia earning good money, but that doesn't mean you've got 200 grand for a deposit, right? And that does take years. I think what it will do is it will give most people, like, they just want to rent something. They rent somewhere, around the city, an apartment looks easy, etc. So I think it'll, create a bit of rental demand for areas that, vacancies are already dropping because there's just a rental shortage. But, we'll create a bit of rental demand and maybe give the, investors a chance to easier sell, not maybe to new migrants, but just because, there's no vacancy and rents are going up a bit. But you're right, it takes years down the line. My big observation with migrants, though, is, especially in Sydney, is that, they move to Sydney to be in Sydney. They move to Sydney to get the lifestyle benefits. Yes, some move to, outer rings, etc. But a lot of the sort of higher income sort of couples from different countries, if they don't want to move away too much from the harbour, let's say, or the beaches, and they're more than happy to, have a really nice apartment. They didn't have the picket white fence sort of Australian dream. They grew up in an apartment. Having a great apartment in Sydney is what they would more than they'd love. You've got a lot of the locals, Sydney couples that can't afford houses that are forced. They don't want to move to Central Coast or Wollongong down in Newmartin. They don't want to move to Hornsby or the Shire, and so they're moving to bigger apartments in around the city. So the local demand, Sydney families are moving there, but also that's what the migrants are going to want as well. And so that's what I think you'll see play out in 3 or 4 years' time, is a lot of the new migrants will be more than happy to sort of buy the nicer, bigger, older apartments around the city.
Yes, absolutely. Well, interesting times there. Now, here was a question from a while ago. Are Aussie banks exposed to changes in New Zealand housing markets? And I'll give you the short answer, no, not now, because the banks in New Zealand have had to hold their own capital in New Zealand. That was changes a couple of years ago. So whilst they might be actually connected with the parents here, they are separate. Didn't used to be the case, but I don't think what's happening in New Zealand is going to necessarily flow on directly from a financial perspective, but I think New Zealand is a bit of a forward indicator of what actually is perhaps going to happen here, insofar that we saw a significant run-up in New Zealand in prices, significant credit growth. They've then now started to lift interest rates, they've started to tighten policy, and now we're seeing prices begin to slide back in New Zealand. And interesting, in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand is now forecasting considerable drop in price in the next 12 months or so. So I think New Zealand's quite an interesting market to watch, Chris. I don't know what you think in terms of what some of those dynamics could be ahead.
Oh, it's a different market, isn't it? It's like you've got, and I know people say, it can happen in, Ireland or the US or, et cetera. Why didn't the, prices of property fall here, et cetera? So you can definitely play But no one's got leverage to Australian residential property like Australia, right? The Australian dream, etc. The fundamentals around migration and etc. So absolutely, I think, and also the government over there, and what they're willing to force in terms of getting more housing affordability, etc. Are they willing to do that over here, etc. So. Absolutely. It's always good to watch these things and learn from other countries around the world and see what happened. I mean, I took so many learnings when I was living in the UK in 2007 to 11, all the way through the GFC, watching shops shut down, watch unemployment in the UK grew 1 million people, and how tough it was. And when I came back to Australia, I've got that sort of insight there. And I look at things a little bit differently to a lot of people. It's the lucky country in their mind, and, there's never been a recession. So, it's good to get that global view, but then it's to apply what happens globally in Australia. It's not that simple. We are, and that's what a lot of economists, your good friend Harry Dent, a lot of them come over here and they sell some books and and promise that what their demographics are going to prove, that prices are going to fall 40% when they go up 60%. It's because they're trying to, put in their housing models that's what's going to happen. And they don't know the fundamental, the way the banking system works and the way that the tax system works and the way that et cetera. No offense, Harry.
Exactly right. Now, Sean, this is one for you, Chris. I'm just going to put this up now. What would happen if there were no mortgage brokers? How would that affect society? Discuss.
I think in fairness to brokers, right? So we'll do probably multiple hundreds of millions of dollars of loans, right? As a broker, most brokers do about 10 to 15 million. Okay. And so most brokers aren't, doing lots and lots of applications. Their average loan is maybe about 500,000. All the stats are there. You type in MFAA, Insight Reports, etc. Absolutely, yeah, brokers are part of it. We're doing 2 and 3 loans. It's the consumer. It's not the broker who's going out and, getting the customers. The customers are coming to brokers. They're walking into banks and asking them to buy. It's not the brokers. They're not creating the demand. It's the consumer going to the broker and then wanting to go and buy a house or wanting to buy an investment property. The brokers aren't knocking on doors saying, hey, do you want to buy a property? Like, that just doesn't happen. The clients come to brokers.
Yeah, well, it is interesting because my consumer surveys show that actually a lot of people prefer to talk to brokers rather than go direct to banks, not least because the brokers give you a broader range of options potentially and actually handle the customer relationships better than directly into the banks themselves. So it's not too surprising.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. I mean, there are issues with, starting out in an industry, and a lot of brokers struggle with credit policy and getting loans, through the system and knowing where to place the deal. But once you've been doing it a few years, you've been doing, lots of applications, you get quite good at knowing where to place the deal. And there's a lot of great brokers out there that can help you. And they do make it much easier. The chance of getting the loan approved is much higher, knowing exactly what your maximum is, education, but also a relationship, if your relationship breaks down or you want to do a renovation or you need to move cities or you need to sell, they're there to guide you longer term. That's what you really want a broker for, is that long-term partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. And just put this one up here, which is quite an interesting comment. Both the Liberals and the Labor are addicted to the Ponzi scheme of mass immigration. We have been in the GDP per capita recession since 2013. And please consider talking to the SAP being, I think, the Sustainability Australia Party. Sure, if they want to come on the show sometime, just get them to reach for me, and I'm happy to have a conversation with them. But the point I wanted to pick up there was, we've got an election next 2 months, right? Is either side of politics going to make a big difference to what happens, or are we actually, is this, Australia Inc., irrespective of who's in power?
No one's going to go near the housing market, or it all backfired, obviously, last. Labor, obviously, likely to win again. They're not going to want to make any mistakes this time, right? And so, what happened last, election sort of, there is a housing affordability issue. This is what this Felinski report is. But, you can already start to see that policies coming off the back of that are not going to be, they're going to create short-term demand. whether you go Labor or Liberal, they're both potentially saying, I think, from the stamp duty change. So I don't think that's going to change anything to sort of the housing market. The fundamentals are still the same. I mean, absolutely. I mean, both countries are, both governments want to, the economy, they want all the figures to look good. So migration is a big part of the story. They're not going to change that story. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just to say, if the Sustainability Party wants to contact me via the DFA blog, they're welcome to, and we'll see whether we can get them to come on and have a conversation. Okay, excellent. Well, we're running out of time, Chris, so I guess what I want to try and do is just get your thoughts now, next 12 months. What are the critical things you'll be looking at and looking for? What are the perspectives you have in terms of where we're going to head, and, overlay the Ukraine situation, the inflationary situation. Pretty uncertain times, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, investors probably trying to pull out of areas because they've been burnt. And if they can get out, we can already start to see clients that are willing to sort of take their money and run. First home buyers, buyers just will be much pickier. A lot of buyers will just sit on their hands, the media story and the fear of, why would I buy now? I'll buy in 12 months' time. So demand will fall through the floor, especially in sort of the affordability market. You're definitely going to see debt stress, listings increase. And so you're going to see some tough times, for a lot of properties. I do think they're going to bang on again around, how hard it is to buy quality assets, in down markets. And, I do think you'll find that because of demographics, if you're doing well financially and you've got a couple of kids and they're going to go to school soon, you need a housing solution. You can't just be like, well, I'm just going to live in this 1-bedroom flat with my 2 kids. And renting's not easy. We've seen a lot of clients who move to regions are wanting to buy in regions because they can't rent. And with the fundamentals, they might only be there for a short period, or they don't even know if they want to be there. So the difficulties of rentings will exist, especially if you want to get into the rent housing market. And they're doing well financially. You wouldn't go and buy, take on a big mortgage unless you were doing well financially. So you're one of the ones that, yes, inflation's going up, but you have seen wage increases. Yes, and you're confident that you're still not at your peak earning capacity and you're working towards a higher income, whether it's education or a promotion or something, right? There's still going to be people out there buying. And even if interest rates went up 1.5%, 2%, if you've got a deposit, it still looks like a good bet versus renting to some property. And especially in the sort of sub 2 million in, say, Sydney, for example, in the good, bigger apartments in, more premium suburbs and certain parts of the housing market as well. So don't assume that the market's just all going to fall 15, 30% or whatever. You will find pockets and certain properties that actually even go up. And and over the next few years, we even saw that in 2017 to 2019. There were certain properties that actually went up in that period, and that was a much higher interest rate environment. And after a much bigger boom, because they were scarce, they offered a tangible lifestyle benefit, and people were willing to take that on, even though they could potentially buy it cheaper in the future, because they know that they've always been waiting for that, and they've got that lifestyle need that they need to get in. So. The market's just going to keep on splitting. Unfortunately, the affordability and the aspirational market are on 2 different timelines. One's got increases in salaries and confidence around interest rates. One's got complete fear and no wage increases.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's certainly interesting. And look, my own modelling is showing prices are definitely beginning to move down, and I think will continue to move down. The rate at which they move will be determined by interest rates, which are uncertain, plus what other unnatural acts the government throws at this, right? And I still think there's, as we discussed earlier, there are still more things they can do to try and actually keep the balloon going a bit further. Because if prices really start to slide dramatically, it puts pressure on the banks and their capital, it puts pressure on households and their confidence and the broader expenditure on the economy. And that's the problem, right? And whenever anybody thinks about property, you've got to understand how it fits into the broader economy here, because we frankly have a property market with a small economy bolted on the side, as I've said a few times.
Yeah, just be careful trying to catch the bouncing ball, right? So, if people go, okay, they get a bit too tricky with it. And, this really caught people out in 2019, myself included, to be honest. The Labor shock election was, wasn't what people thought would happen. And literally that weekend, we saw buyers that were going against the grain in early 2019, for example, that were, looking at it and going, wow, this is such good buying compared to what things were. But But yeah, just be careful with that as well, because you can easily get caught out. Sentiment can shift pretty fast. And so, yeah, don't try to get too tricky with it. Even if, for example, you find the right place, focus on the long terms. Is this the place that we want to live in long term? Is it going to offer us the lifestyle that we want? Can we afford a 4% interest rate? Are we willing to bet on the fundamentals of that suburb not shifting dramatically in terms of its desirability? And have we done all the other due diligence, etc.? Right, let's do it. Yeah.
And the point I want to emphasise there, and I keep coming back to, you should be making a decision about property not in a sort of 18-month, 2-year window, right? 5 to 10 years is a more realistic view of what you might be wanting to do, because you've got to think about the costs of getting in, right? And the fact is, it's unlikely that in the next couple of years we're going to see significant capital growth. So you need a longer-term view. Yeah,
we even try to go longer than that, and our clients will say, "Oh yeah, they'll do it for 5 years." And they go, "Well, why wouldn't I do longer than that? Do you want to live somewhere else?" "Oh no, we'd love to stay there." Okay, so you're going to buy something that's going to give you that short runway. You're telling me you want to have 2 kids, you want to buy a 2-bedroom apartment. How long you're actually going to really be able to live in that? What are you going to do then? Then you have to sell, pay stamp duty, selling costs. That 3-bed's probably gone up more because it's scarcer and it's more desirable to the family markets. You've got more families that are going to want to upgrade by then. There's not going to be any more supply created. So absolutely, it's thinking about things a lot longer than that. Now, sure, you don't have to plan your life out over 30 years and say you're going to stay in this house, but at least give you the chance, the option of staying there. At least in your mind, thinking it's going to be a good option if you do decide to stick around, not saying, "Oh, it'll be fine for 5 years and then we'll just figure it out then." And, if you're buying an investment and you plan, trading investment properties is really tough, because then even if you do make money, you pay capital gains tax. And then you got to go and buy another property, and then you got to find that, and it's hard to find it, etc. So if you do get yourself a good asset, which you should only be buying a quality asset, then you can get the equity on that. Why would you sell it? So when you're buying an investment property, you've got to be thinking a lot longer than that. Like, why would I sell this I'm 35 now. Why would I sell it at 45? The rents have gone up a bit. I'm still okay to service it. I'll keep it for another 10 years. And when you get to 55, why would you sell it now when you've got to pay those capital gains tax? You'd hold it for another 10 years. So with investment properties, I'd be thinking a lot longer, especially if you've got a bit of runway up your sleeve. And probably doesn't really make sense when you get close to your retirement age. It's too lumpy, etc. So most people who invest in property should be in the younger years. And if you're buying a home, just give yourself the option. It doesn't mean you have to commit to that for the next 20 years. But if that is what you do decide to stay, it's a great solution for you.
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you very much, Chris. We've hit our deadline, and you filled the time so wonderfully well with so many important points that I think people need to watch the show 2 or 3 times to get them all out, right? But thank you very much. Really appreciate it, and we'll do it again sometime soon. And by the time we talk again, I'm sure the markets will have morphed once again.
That's right, Martin. Back to Daddy Daycare here. So, yeah, I'll see you soon.
Yeah, take care. Thanks very much. See you later.
Yeah,
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. So there you are, folks. Hope you found that useful. A very interesting conversation. Chris is always great value. Just in terms of doggy cam, we found Luna. She was down the other end of the mat. I don't know where Meteor is, but I suspect Meteor is sitting on the sofa. She's definitely very interested in sitting in the most comfortable place in the room. So thank you for spending some time with us this evening. Just before I go, I wanted to tell you that next week I have Damien Klassen on for our discussion about investing, and of course the last month has been pretty horrendous in terms of the market, so I'll be able to get an interesting perspective from him as to what's happening with regards to the market over the next little while. I'm sure it'll be worth watching. And meantime, I'm updating my scenarios and my stress data. So the week after next, I'm planning to run a show specifically on mortgage stress and our modelling, which will also show the latest scenario. So hopefully that'll be worthwhile as well. So I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with me tonight and for listening to Chris. And have a good evening. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time on the show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.